Welcome back to Spectrum Sundays, where we introduce professionals and self-advocates who play an important role in the autism community.
And this week, we are very excited to welcome to our series Jessie Ginsburg, who is a fellow autism advocate and a very accomplished speech language pathologist.
Thank you, too, for inviting me. I'm so excited.
Thank you. So could you start by giving us a quick resume of your experiences and your education?
Of course. So it's so funny, and I don't know if you two ever feel this way, where it just feels like one arbitrary small decision. When you look back on your life, it's those that end up shaping your life completely. So that is definitely what happened with me, because when I graduated from college, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I mean, none, but I had enough hours to get my SLP assistant license. So I thought I'll just do it for a year. I really didn't think I was going to want to do it for life. And I applied all over LA, Los Angeles, and guess how many interviews I got? One interview. And it was at this multidisciplinary clinic. So I went in for my interview and they said, here's where we do speech, here's where we do floor time, here's where we do social skills. And that at the end of the interview, they offered me the job and I accepted. And then I went home and I Googled, what is floor time? I'd never heard of it. I was just smiling and nodding in the interview. And it's ironic because learning floor time is essentially what has completely shaped my career thus far. And for anyone who doesn't know, floor time is an approach to treating lots of types of kids, most specifically known for treating autism. And it's really a developmental approach where you work on connecting with the child, but also at the same time challenging the child to continue to grow and learn. So I ended up getting trained in floor time. This was right after college. And then I decided I wanted to go back for my master's. So I went and I got my master's. And right after that, I moved to Washington, D.C. And I accepted my clinical fellowship position there. And it just so happens that I connected with Jake Greenspan, who is the son of Dr. Stanley Greenspan, who created Floor Time. And I ironically turned down a job at the Floor Time Center because I was so terrified of working only with autism. I just didn't feel like I knew if I could do it, if I had the skills or if I had the energy. So I turned that job down. But then within that year, I think it was that first year, Jake and I had started collaborating and started presenting at ASHA, which is the National Convention on how SLPs can integrate floor time into their practice. So honestly, it just all snowballed from there. I moved to LA. I opened my own practice right after I finished my clinical fellowship, which a lot of people thought was crazy. And here I am now. I own this practice. We have about 10 employees here, and it's amazing. I love every minute of it.
That is incredible. So from start to finish, about how long was your path to where you are now in your CEO position?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I have never worked for someone else for longer than maybe like 9 months. So I had one job for less than a year, and then I had another job for less than a year. So, and then I just, after maybe my first year in private practice, I started hiring. So yeah, it's been great. It's been a huge learning experience. They don't teach you business skills in grad school, but yeah.
We admire you so much for everything that you've accomplished. We wanted to ask you about, where your passion for autism really started, and what are some of the most memorable experiences that you've had working with those on the spectrum?
Yeah, it's funny because I had really, I would say, minimal, experience working with autism, and until that job where I was trained in floor time, and then all of a sudden my whole life became autism after that. But I have to say my most memorable experiences are I have very specific kids that I remember and I talk about when I present or when I speak, because the stories are so emotional and just they're very moving, you know. So there's this one boy, for instance, that I used to see when he was in preschool. And so he was, 4 or so at the time. But prior to seeing me, he did floor time therapy for a few years. He really struggled with engagement and joint attention and regulation. So all of those foundational skills were really hard for him. But then by the time he got to me, it was more his play skills and his social skills. And, he had a hard time making friends because he always wanted to play what he wanted to play and had trouble being able to build those strong relationships with his peers. So I saw him in a social skills group. And then I saw him for, close to a year. And then he moved away and he was starting in a mainstream kindergarten. And I was so scared. I knew that's where he needed to be. And I was excited, but I was just so nervous, to see what life would transform into for him. And then about a month later, after he started school, his mom sent me an email and she said, his teacher said kids fight to sit next to him at lunch or stand behind him in line. And he's the most social, creative, polite kid she's taught in so long, and that he's by far the most loved kid in the class. And that's like the number one thing you can ever hear from a parent. Because what more do you want for the kids you're treating? So I think it's easy for therapists to put kids in a box, or parents, or teachers, and say, this is what a child is capable of and this is all he can do, but there's so much more. And we need to treat the child as if there is unlimited potential in them, because that is in fact true,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a great segue into our next question about misconceptions as well. Because especially with the autism community, I think that there are a lot of really hurtful misconceptions and stereotypes because of the types of difficulties they have with social engagement and joint attention and emotional regulation. So if there is something that you would feel is the most important thing for others to understand about autism, what would that be?
I think that one of the most inspiring quotes I've read and I posted recently is that being autistic is just another way of being human. So understanding that autism is not a tragedy. It's simply that this child is experiencing and seeing the world in a different way, and knowing that everything the child is doing and everything the child is saying makes so much sense when you can flip your perspective to start thinking about, well, how is this child seeing the world? And, what does this mean to him? Everything that child is going to do is going to make sense.
Absolutely. And it's so easy to sit and say, put yourself in someone else's shoes. But until you really invest in that idea and try it, you have no idea what else is out there. And especially with the community that we work with, there are so many talents and traits that they have to offer to the world. And without opening our minds and our hearts to what that perspective really looks like for them, I think that we're at a loss if we don't take advantage of that, and allow them the avenue to really explore what it is that makes them who they are. It's really incredible. So we wanted to ask you a little bit about a treatment approach that you've actually developed in your marketing right now called ASD from the Inside Out. So could you tell us a little bit about that and how clinicians can access your courses?
Of course. So this came from this idea that I was seeing, which was in school, we are taught when we are working with autism, we are taught you target 2 areas. You target language and social skills. When you're an SLP, that's what you're responsible for. But what I was finding is that if we are only honing in on those 2 areas, we are completely missing the whole child approach and everything that the child needs to be successful. So this is kind of how the course started. I wrote an article for the ASHA Leader, which is the national magazine for SLPs and audiologists. So I wrote an article about this, which is when you come into a session and you meet a new child, and that child hasn't started speaking yet, and a lot of people will give the child a diagnosis or a label as being nonverbal, which I will be talking about this week, actually, reframing how we talk about kids. But that's just kind of what you see it as. You see this as a child, he's not talking yet, I need him to talk, we need to target language. So what happens when we target language for a child who is missing these foundational skills? Because a lot of the kids that we're seeing who don't yet have language, they also have really significant difficulties with regulation and sensory processing and engagement. And maybe they're not really intrinsically motivated to interact and communicate with you. So when all of those foundational skills are missing and we go directly to working on language, I describe it as a staircase where the foundational skills are the lower level steps, language is the middle, and then those higher level language and cognitive skills are at the top. So if a child has all these holes in the bottom of their staircase and we go in and we try to jump straight into working on language, that child is never going to reach the top of the staircase because their staircase isn't going to be stable enough for them to go up. So what we really need to do is start focusing on starting with how can we build these foundational skills that we need? Because if we can do that, the child will develop novel, flexible language naturally, with our help, but it will be in a lot more natural and meaningful and everlasting way than skipping those steps. So yes, that's a course that I teach. It's online. It's a go at your own pace course. Yeah.
That sounds like a wonderful opportunity for a lot of our viewers who are interested in the field to take up. Thank you so much for explaining a little bit about that. Something that you mentioned a little bit before was about how we approach the conversations about children, especially when talking to the family. And recently you had an interview with Rachel Dorsey, who's an autistic SLP, on the ASHA Voices podcast, about building confidence and positive perspectives for parents. So for us as novice clinicians, I think this is the hardest skill to learn and to rein in. So I'm curious if you could share some of your knowledge and advice of counseling families with our viewers.
Absolutely. And just, so I don't think this is about being a new clinician or not. I think this is something that everyone struggles with, no matter how long they've been in the field. And counseling parents and talking to parents is obviously a huge part of what we do, but I think that's something that's really hard for a lot of us. So I think that, one of the biggest things we can do when we're talking about families about autism is, first of all, any counseling situation, really validating a parent's feelings and acknowledging that whatever they're feeling and they're experiencing is valid and real, and they are allowed to feel that way. But then, we have so much power in the language that we use to describe their child. We, by how we describe the child, can affect how that parent is perceiving their child. So what we say matters. So something that we can do is use more of a strengths-based approach, which means instead of describing their child as here are all of his deficits and difficulties and challenges and negative behaviors, we can talk about all of the strengths that the child has and really just try to reframe how we talk about that. And one of the things that made a huge difference for me, I interviewed this autistic young woman. She's in her early 20s, and she is the co-founder of a nonprofit called Autism. Her and her twin sister are both autistic. Her twin sister actually is on TV. She's an actress on, oh my gosh, I was just watching the trailer on YouTube and I can't remember. I want to say it's called Everything's Gonna Be All Right or something. Does that ring a bell?
We'll have to look into it after.
Yeah,
we'll fact check that.
So I was interviewing her, and she said, you know, her whole life she was told that she was too obsessed with reading and too obsessed with movies. And when she went into social skills groups, they would tell her, no, they're not interested in hearing about that. So you need to figure out something that your friends want to talk about, you know? But then she grew up and she's like, why should I have to change my interests to fit these people, you know, when in reality, the strongest relationships I've built my whole life have been people who have similar interests and are like-minded. So now, you know, she writes TV scripts and she's a blogger and is doing all these amazing things, and her sister too. But I'm sure it's because her parents fostered that in her. So it's a matter of just reframing, you know, things that a child might be, we might say obsessed, and replacing that with, this child is very passionate and enthusiastic about this specific topic. I honestly don't even remember what your question is, but I just went down that path.
No, that's okay. I love the idea of approaching everything with a positive mindset. And I think that's something that Francesca and I have tried to do with this initiative of Spectrum Sundays, is really informing in a positive way, and less focusing on the deficits or the things that a child can't do and more on what they can do. So that's incredible that you're even talking to actually autistic voices, and you're helping others embrace what it is that makes them who they are. And the obsessive piece or the passionate piece that we want to put that positive spin on, that's a characteristic, but it's also, it helps contribute to why they can be so successful if we allow them to explore that, and if we embrace that in them. Something that I wanted to go back on that we kind of touched on earlier was this idea of sensory processing for an individual with autism. So could you explain that from a professional perspective, but also in kind of lay terms for anyone that might not be familiar with what that might mean and what it looks like in a person with autism?
Yeah, so, you know, every person has different, we could say, sensory preferences. Some people like deep, hard massages, and some people like light massages, right? It's as simple as that. So same with kids on the spectrum, is we tend to see lots of difficulties with their processing of sensory information. So what I like to describe to parents is, and I think I have a video on my page about this, is an iceberg analogy, which is, I didn't make this up, by the way, so I'm not taking the credit for this. But all we see at the tip of the iceberg is the behavior, whether it's good or hard, whatever it is. I'm not trying to label it as good as bad, but all we see is what is the child doing. And we so often fail to think about what is under the surface, because that's really what is causing the behavior. So for autistic kids, a lot of the times there's something going on down here that's related to sensory processing. You know, so for instance, if a child is sensitive to auditory input and they walk into a room and they cover their ears, right? The behavior you're seeing is covering their ears, and the reason is they're sensitive to auditory input. But that's something that is very easy for us to just look over and try to figure out how to solve without even considering the reason behind it. So something I like to use as an analogy about a sensory processing seesaw when we're in therapy sessions. So if we picture a seesaw and it's balanced, that means the child is regulated, and that's really in the place where they're ready to learn. And then what we might see in our sessions is something might start to tip the seesaw and the child might start to get a little dysregulated. So our job at that time is not to continue challenging the child, but to bring the seesaw back to center, because this is where the child needs to be to really be in a place where he's ready to learn. And I explain it to families and parents in a way they can understand, you know, just like if you went to Disneyland all day and you were surrounded with all these people and all these noise, all you want to do is go home and just relax and watch TV or read a book or something, you know? So we naturally know how to get our seesaws back to center, whereas a lot of autistic children might need our help until they can learn how to self-regulate. So that's just a visual I like to use to explain it.
Kind of as a follow-up, is there any piece of advice for anyone just in the general public that might not understand when it's happening? Any piece of information that we can even share as we continue to move forward so that people can understand that better?
It's funny because I think sensory processing is one of those things that usually only occupational therapists learn about in school. As you guys probably know, in speech, you barely learn anything. So it's hard to find resources to make sense of it all. So for me, I was just always Googling and looking up continuing ed classes and things like that. But any of the books by Dr. Greenspan are awesome and have really good explanations of sensory processing.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, just this weekend, someone told me a story about how they had missed a sign in a child they had worked with for a really long time, and it led to an outburst, and how easily it could have been avoided if she had just noticed some of those small signs that they were uncomfortable and whatnot. So I think that would, maybe some of those resources would be great for our community.
Yeah, I think that with that, it's just, we get so focused on what our goals are and what we're trying to accomplish in that session that a lot of the times we're not thinking about these underlying foundational skills, which we really need to be strong and balanced in order to actually get to our goals or the results that we want.
Yeah. Actually, so I wanted to bring up the topic of first-person language versus person-first language. I'm sorry, person-first language versus identity-first language. And we referenced Rachel as autistic, and some people might prefer to call her person with autism. So could you explain what labels that you use and what your take is on that and why you take that stance?
Yeah, it's a hard subject because, and you are in school, so you guys probably get to hear this all the time, but when you're in school, you are just drilled on person first language is what you use, and that's what is respectful, and the person is first and foremost a person. And I always got that, but I not only understood that, I was really, I strongly believed that, and it was just one of those things where, you know, your professors, they teach you things and you just assume that's how it's supposed to be. And then I just, obviously with me being immersed in the autistic community is a huge part of what I do. And I realized that the autistic community is begging us to use identity first language, which is saying an autistic person. And the reason for that is they're saying when you use identity first language, you are saying that autism is a valuable piece of this person. They should take pride in that. It's not about them having some kind of disability or disorder that they're carrying with them. It's, this is who I am and this is part of my identity. So I think it's a huge mindset shift for professionals, parents, anyone working in this field, because it's so different than what we've been used to. But I just was starting to feel like, you know, we're lucky that we have all of these people who have grown up, these autistic people have grown up in therapy and they've done it and they've been through it, and now they can share their experiences with us. So why aren't we listening? They have the voices to tell us what they feel comfortable with, and I think it's our responsibility to listen, you know. But I think the main point is that we all want to be respectful. We're in a helping profession. We're not here to put people down, but the language, you know, this goes back to what we were talking about, which is the language we use has a huge impact on families. So if we can help families to use identity first language, or help them to understand that autism is not a tragedy, autism is this beautiful thing that makes your child who they are, and we're going to, you know, capitalize on the strengths that they have and embrace this child for who they are, then we can get the parent to really help. We can not only build the parent's positive image of their child, but then that in the future helps the child to develop a positive self-concept, because they've grown up with this parent who accepts them and embraces them for who they are. They're not constantly trying to change them.
Right. I think it's such a beautiful thing to consider how much identity is rooted in this community, and it is something to be proud of. And if anyone watching is familiar with the deaf community, there's a lot of pride in that community, and they capitalize the D in deaf, and they don't want to be called a person hard of hearing. They want to be called a deaf person. And the same thing applies with autistic individuals. And it is so hard when we're, first of all, new clinicians kind of first coming into the field, and we want to be respectful. But I think it's also really interesting to hear how many different perspectives are out there, and that not just one is the correct way. It's really, it depends on the person. So I love hearing what you've had to share about that as well. So one of the goals that we have with Spectrum Sundays is to create a community of appreciation and acceptance for autism. So we wanted to ask you, you know, it seems like you've had a pretty gradual process in where you've become an advocate, but what has acceptance and inclusion meant in your life as you've kind of moved into this role professionally?
Yeah, I think that some of the times I've learned the most are working with parents who have autistic children, and now just being able to make friends with other people in the autistic community. And, you know, there's a difference between volunteering your time to go help a cause and simply building a relationship with someone because it's mutually beneficial for you, you know? So that's kind of how I look at it, is that the time I invest in these relationships with those who are in the autistic community is I'm learning more from them, I'm sure, than they're learning from me. But there's just so much that we could do more in our day-to-day life to be able to expand our, you know, friendship circle and the relationships with the people that we're meeting and interacting with. And online is a great way to do that now, luckily.
Yeah, I think it's so important, like you said, instead of just volunteering your time, look at it as a chance to build relationships. And even if you do one kind thing for someone that you're working with, it could be the highlight of their day. So just always trying to be authentic and genuine, and hopefully that relationship would last a lifetime, but it could change not just their day, but their life through just one true friendship.
Definitely.
So if there's one idea or message that our viewers could take away from our conversation today, what would that be?
I think that it all comes down to embracing kids for who they are and being able to use that strengths-based approach like we talked about when we meet new kids and new families, being able to explain to them all the amazing things about their kid, and getting parents to really accept and embrace their kids for who they are. And there's just such an impact we can have from so early on. And I think that we need to really take advantage of that in those relationships that we have with families.
Yes, it's all about building trust, I think. And as Francesca and I have kind of moved into this role of like a public figure advocating on behalf of other people that we don't have the personal experience of being autistic or having a direct family member who has autism. So it's so important to build that trust and really strengthen those relationships before you move forward with anything that you're trying to advocate for. And also,
yeah, and with that, I think that being able, just taking the time, as professionals working in this community, it's our responsibility to take the time to see what's out there and research and read and meet people and have these conversations. So I think that, we need to be listening to these autistic voices, and there are so many people that want to be heard, but they're so tired from just being shut down for so long. And I think now is the time where we really need to amplify those voices of the people who, are willing and able to speak up for the community.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that as well. So you are a very busy woman and you run an amazing website and Instagram and all this social media. So what are some upcoming events that you have planned that we can share with our viewers so they can tune into everything that you're involved in?
So I do Facebook Lives every week or Instagram Lives every week. So I try to keep them short and sweet with lots of good, helpful tips and information. So I'm always on there. On Facebook, we have a private group. It's called Young Autism SLPs. If you guys are even on Facebook, I know a lot of people are coming off of that, the younger generation. But yeah, so I'm out there every week, trying to share and train.
That's great. For me, I find that helpful because I'm involved with Loud Crowd, and I've been using the Parkinson's Voice Project live videos to help me with my training. So I'm sure that anyone who is interested with working with the autism community might find that helpful as well. So we definitely use Facebook.
For sure.
Great. So is there anywhere else where our viewers can find you on Instagram and whatnot? What's your handle they can find you at?
Yeah, on Instagram, I'm jessieginsburg.slp. And then my website is asdfromtheinsideout.com. So on that website, I have a lot of trainings and videos. I have a lot of free trainings and videos as well. That's where you can find access to my course. And I also have a mini course that just came out, which is all about sensory processing for SLPs.
Well, thank you so much, Jessie. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your story, to share your expertise and your insight, so that hopefully we can inspire a community of a community of inclusion for so many of those who truly desire it. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. And you guys are doing amazing things. So keep it up.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you everybody for watching. Please tune in next week for Spectrum Sundays on Sunday.